Do you believe in forgiving or forgetting?
Are you ready for a shocking truth? Yesterday, something unbelievable happened to me, and I swear if I did not have the paperwork in my hand right now, even I would question whether it really played out the way it did. My brother managed to total my car, the only car I own, the car I use to get to work, buy groceries, and take care of every single basic responsibility in my life, and instead of showing even an ounce of genuine regret, he stood in my living room with that half smile he always uses when he knows Mom and Dad will shield him, and he said the words that made my jaw lock in place. "You will have to forgive me, because they will not let you stay mad." He was so sure of himself, so smug, and what truly cut the deepest was watching my parents nod like his words were some kind of unshakable truth, like I had already lost the right to even be upset. In that moment, I felt the same sinking weight I have carried for years, the one that shows up every time my brother wrecks something and everyone looks at me like I should be the bigger person. As if my role in this family is not daughter or sister, but designated cleanup crew. They all expected me to sigh, maybe cry, and then accept it, because that is what I have always done. But this time I stayed quiet. I did not yell, I did not cry, and I did not storm out. I nodded, too, but not for the same reason they did. I nodded because I already had another plan. The truth is, the very minute I got the call about the accident, I had already logged into my insurance account and opened a claim. Not a half-hearted claim either, a full, detailed one where I made sure to document that the driver was unauthorized, that he had borrowed my car without permission, and that I was aware of prior incidents that might need to be disclosed if the adjuster asked. I knew this was not going to be a normal family spat. This was about money, accountability, and proof, and for once, I was not going to hand him a free pass to stomp all over me while everyone else turned their heads. I started building my folder. Screenshots of texts where he begged to just borrow the car for a quick errand. The email from months ago where I declined to list him as an occasional driver because I did not trust him. Even the petty things, like him joking over Thanksgiving that insurance always covers it because it has to, went into that folder. Every single piece of paper or screenshot was another brick in the wall I was building, not to wall myself in but to wall him out, to make sure that this time, when the smoke cleared, I was not left paying the bill for his arrogance. When he stood there and smirked in my face, waiting for me to fold, I thought about the dozens of other times I had taken the fall. When he dented the neighbor's mailbox and somehow I ended up apologizing. When he racked up parking tickets on my old car, and I paid them just to keep the late fees from snowballing. When he used my address to get a cheaper insurance quote, and I let it slide because it is family. All those times, I told myself it was not worth the fight. But every one of those memories added fuel to the quiet fire I was feeling now. I kept my tone even and asked him to send me his version of the incident in writing. He laughed and said, "Why, are you going to sue me?" I smiled back. Not because I found him funny, but because I knew that every arrogant word he texted or emailed me would be timestamped, stored, and potentially forwarded to someone who did not care about family loyalty, someone who only cared about facts, laws, and signatures. I gave him rope, and he happily typed away, bragging that insurance will take care of it like always. What none of them realized was that I had already had my first quiet win. Less than 24 hours after I filed the claim, the insurance adjuster called me, speaking carefully, almost hesitantly, and said there seemed to be a discrepancy with the driver's record. They wanted permission to pull additional reports. I kept my voice calm, even though inside I was practically shaking with the energy of it all, and I said, "Yes, please go ahead." My parents were still circling me, repeating the same tired lines about how holding grudges only hurts me, about how family matters should never leave the living room, about how my brother just needs support right now. I nodded again, but this time it was harder to hide my smile, because they had no idea that the next move was not theirs or his. The next move belonged to the insurance company, and when it came, it would not be about feelings or family dinners. It would be about cold, hard truth on paper, and for the first time in my life, I knew I had more of that truth in my corner than he did. The episode does not end with yelling, plates thrown, or some dramatic confrontation. It ends with me, sitting quietly with a growing stack of documents, listening to the phone buzz with another message from my brother, one I knew would go straight into the folder. He thought this was just another mess I would clean up. He thought Mom and Dad would lean on me until I gave in. He had no idea that I had already started the process that would turn his smug little smile into something else entirely. And when the insurance adjuster ended the call by saying, "We might need to talk about prior incidents we found," I knew the real story had only just begun. When I woke up the next morning, I already knew that nothing about this situation was going to be simple, because if I let it play out the way it always had before, the pattern would repeat. My brother would shrug off responsibility. My parents would soothe him, and I would be left piecing together the financial damage and pretending it was no big deal. But this time I decided I would not let the story be written for me. I would write it myself, and the first step was gathering every shred of proof that could shift the balance away from his words and back toward hard, undeniable facts. So I started with the obvious, pulling the police incident report that listed him as the driver, which might have seemed like a small thing on its own, but in reality it was a cornerstone. Because for years he had managed to manipulate family stories by twisting words and convincing our parents that events had been exaggerated. But now I had a government-issued document that said otherwise, stamped, dated, and signed. Something he could not laugh off or call a misunderstanding. I added to that the old email from the neighbor who had written to me after his car was sideswiped, politely asking for my brother's insurance details, as if it were my responsibility, and I had paid out of pocket just to make the problem disappear. But now that email was in my folder, waiting for its chance to reappear at the exact moment he least expected it. I went deeper, looking through old files until I found the completion notice from the traffic school he had been required to attend after what he had once described to our parents as a single ticket, though the paperwork showed it had been issued after a reckless driving charge, not just a harmless mistake. I even contacted his former insurer, framing it as a request for information related to shared coverage, and within days I had a letter confirming that his policy had been dropped due to multiple claims and unpaid premiums. Every page I printed felt like a tiny slice across the carefully built image he projected, and while one slice on its own might not destroy anything, the accumulation of those small, sharp cuts had the power to bleed his whole story dry. Meanwhile, my parents seemed almost desperate to reestablish the usual script, calling me multiple times to say that forgiveness was healthier than anger, that money comes and goes, and that the real priority was making sure my brother didn't feel attacked. As if my silence and my quiet documentation work were somehow acts of cruelty. I listened, I nodded, and I kept my mouth shut because I had finally realized that arguing with them directly was a dead end. The more I fought, the more defensive they became, but if I let the documents do the speaking, if I allowed the system to reveal what he had hidden, then they would not have a choice but to see him for what he was. The insurance adjuster called again, this time with a measured tone that suggested they already suspected there was more to the story than what he had admitted, and they asked whether I would consent to them running a broader search of his driving history. I agreed without hesitation, and then I made sure to get the confirmation in writing, because every recorded line, every emailed confirmation, and every notarized signature was another barrier between me and the inevitable pleas that would come when my parents tried to convince me to back down. What truly shifted my thinking, though, was when I remembered something he had casually mentioned at a family barbecue a few months earlier, bragging that his job gave him access to a company car and that they trusted him enough to drive colleagues on business trips. He had said it like it was proof that he was responsible and mature, but now that detail stood out in a different light, because I knew companies did not hand out car keys blindly. They had policies, and those policies always included motor vehicle checks. If he had hidden his suspension or downplayed his history, then his job could be at risk, and while I had no intention of destroying his career just for the sake of revenge, I understood that facts have a way of traveling farther than you plan once they are set free, and if his lies reached into his workplace, the fallout might be bigger than even I imagined. Still, I stayed focused on the immediate battle, which was making sure that the financial liability of the crash did not land on my shoulders. I informed the adjuster, in a calm and professional email, that I would not be withdrawing the claim under any circumstances, even if family members attempted to intervene, and I stated clearly that since the driver was unlisted and unauthorized, I expected the insurer to pursue recovery from him directly. Writing those words felt like a turning point, because it was the first time I had not only collected proof but also declared out loud, in black and white, that I refused to play the role they had written for me. When I hit send on that message, I almost laughed, not because it was funny, but because it felt so surreal to finally realize that I had power in a situation where I had always felt powerless. My brother thought I would fold, my parents thought I would cave, and yet there I was, building a case brick by brick, slice by slice, until it could no longer be ignored. And as if the universe wanted to underline my decision, the adjuster ended the call with a quiet sentence that hung in the air long after I set my phone down. "We found something in his record that doesn't match what he told us, and we will need to discuss it with you." In that moment, I knew the paper cuts were starting to show, and soon enough, he would feel every single one of them. When the envelope from the insurance company finally arrived, thick and weighty in my mailbox, I knew before I even tore it open that whatever was inside was going to change the balance of power in my family forever. Because the adjuster had already hinted on the phone that what they uncovered was not some minor detail or harmless oversight, but a pattern, a history that had been carefully hidden under jokes, excuses, and the blind faith of my parents who never wanted to believe that their son was anything but unlucky. I sat at my kitchen table, the stack of documents spread out in front of me, and for the first time in years, I felt the kind of calm you only feel when you know the truth is finally on your side. Because page after page showed what I had always suspected but could never prove, that my brother's driving history was not an accident-prone streak or a string of bad luck, but a record of reckless choices, unpaid fines, and failures to appear that had been neatly buried beneath his charm and his constant ability to spin a story. The report listed not one but two prior at-fault accidents, both of which he had glossed over to our parents as fender benders, when in reality they had involved claims paid out and letters sent, documents that bore his name and his license number, and that now sat in black and white for me to see. Then there was the suspension, something I had always doubted when a distant cousin once mentioned it at a holiday dinner, because when I asked him about it later, he laughed and said it was a misunderstanding, a clerical error, but here it was in writing. A license suspension tied to a failure to appear after a reckless driving ticket, meaning it had not been a mistake at all, but a choice to ignore the consequences until the state forced his hand. The most telling detail, however, was the record of a lapsed policy, canceled after non-payment, followed by another claim attempt under a different provider, a clear sign that this was not one isolated problem, but a trail of irresponsibility. That stretched back years. I knew immediately what this meant for the narrative my parents had clung to, the one where I was the rigid, unforgiving sister who could not let things go, while he was the golden child who just stumbled into trouble, but always meant well. With this report in my hands, that story cracked in half, because no matter how much they wanted to believe otherwise, no amount of nodding or pleading could erase the fact that he had lied to them repeatedly, and that his lies had been expensive, deliberate, and far-reaching. I called for a family meeting, though I did not announce it with the same drama they were used to. I simply said I wanted to sit down and talk it through, and when we gathered in the living room, my parents looking nervous and my brother leaning back with that same smug smirk that said he believed he was untouchable, I did not launch into a speech or raise my voice. I placed the documents on the coffee table, slid the top page toward him, and told him calmly to read. For a moment he laughed, rolling his eyes like this was another one of my overreactions, but as his eyes moved down the page and he saw words like suspension, at-fault accident, and non-renewal, the smile faltered. And that was the first crack in his confidence I had seen in years. My parents, still clinging to their hope that this was all a misunderstanding, asked him to explain, but his explanations came out jagged and inconsistent, first blaming clerical errors, then saying the accidents were minor, then trying to pivot to how everyone makes mistakes, and all the while I sat silently, because I realized that my power in this moment was not in arguing or defending myself, but in letting the paper speak for me. Every time he opened his mouth, the report contradicted him, and every time he tried to deflect, another page brought him back to the truth. The irony that struck me hardest was remembering how he had boasted about his job's trust in him, how he had bragged about being allowed to drive a company car and shuttle colleagues to retreats when their employee handbook, which I had quietly downloaded from their website weeks earlier, spelled out in plain terms that any undisclosed suspension or pattern of violations was grounds for immediate review. It was almost laughable, the way he had leaned on his work as proof of his reliability, not realizing that his very record threatened to unravel the thing he thought made him look untouchable. I made my move carefully, waiting until the tension in the room was thick enough that even my parents could no longer deny what they were seeing. And then I said in a calm voice that I had already informed the insurer in writing that I would pursue recovery directly from him if coverage was denied, and that I had attached his own message bragging about how insurance always covers it, as part of my documentation. The silence that followed was deafening because they realized I had not only collected proof but also weaponized his arrogance in a way he could not wiggle out of. When my mother tried to plead with me, asking why I would go so far, I reminded her that I had already gone far enough covering for him for years, that I had already paid more than my share of his mistakes, and that this time I was not willing to be the cushion he fell on. She started to cry. My father looked furious, but I kept my composure, because I knew if I faltered now, the pattern would reset and all of this would have been for nothing. As the meeting ended, I left the stack of documents on the table and walked out with only one line: "If you think this is me being cruel, then you have no idea what comes next." My brother called after me, his voice finally shaking, demanding to know what I meant, but I did not answer, because the truth was I had already decided what my next move would be, and it had nothing to do with family discussions. What none of them realized yet was that I had already picked up the phone earlier that day, not to shout or threaten, but to ask a simple, quiet question to the compliance office at his job, and the number was still saved in my recent calls, waiting to be pressed again. That thought was my cliffhanger, the knowledge that the record in front of me was not just evidence of the past, but leverage for the future, and when the time came, I would know exactly how to use it. When I finally decided to press the number saved in my recent calls, the one that connected me directly to the compliance office at my brother's job, I did it with the same calmness I had been carrying since the night he laughed in my face, because I knew by then that shouting or raging would only burn up my energy without changing a thing, but facts, documents, and signatures had a way of moving silently through the channels of power until they landed where no one could ignore them. I did not make the call out of spite or a desire to humiliate him in front of strangers. I made it because I had learned the hard way that protecting him had never once protected me, and if his record reached into areas he had lied about, then the truth deserved to be known there too, regardless of how much it shook his carefully crafted image. The conversation with the compliance officer was almost unnervingly straightforward, lacking any of the drama or emotional bargaining I had come to expect from family interactions. I stated that I was providing documentation related to a driver listed on my insurance claim, that the individual had previously disclosed inaccurate information about their driving history, and that I believed it might conflict with the company's own policies regarding motor vehicle use. I did not add commentary. I did not embellish with stories of how he had manipulated our parents or taken advantage of me for years, because I had finally realized those details did not matter in the world outside our family bubble. In the corporate world, what mattered was whether or not an employee had lied on paperwork or put the company at risk, and with every PDF and scanned page I attached, I knew the decision was no longer mine to make, it was theirs. Within days, I received a carefully worded response from Human Resources, not addressed to me by name but to the reporting party, thanking me for the submission and confirming that they had suspended his driving privileges pending further review. Reading those words, I felt something shift inside me, not a rush of glee or triumph, but a quieter, heavier sense of validation. Because for the first time the consequences that had always bounced off him and landed on me were finally circling back to their rightful owner. He called me that evening, his voice raised, accusing me of betrayal, of ruining his career, of crossing some invisible line that family should never cross, but instead of fighting back, I simply told him, "Then this will be our last conversation about it," and hung up because I had nothing left to defend. The irony was that while he had been accusing me of destroying his career, he had already been destroying it himself long before I ever touched the phone. Because a company that puts its employees behind the wheel of pool cars or allows them to represent the business on the road cannot afford to have someone with hidden suspensions and repeat at-fault accidents on their roster. And all I had done was make sure the truth traveled where it was supposed to. My parents, of course, did not see it that way. They called me together, telling me that whatever problems he had with insurance or driving could have been handled within the family, as if I had betrayed some sacred pact. But I reminded them in the calmest voice I could muster that every time I had handled things within the family, I had ended up paying the bill, covering the damage, or swallowing the guilt. And that this time I had decided to let the systems designed to deal with people like him do their work. The next escalation came not from me but from the insurance company, who reached out to inform me that, due to misrepresentation in his statements and his unlisted status as a driver, they were pivoting towards subrogation, which meant they would not simply cover the damage and let it vanish into higher premiums, but would actively pursue him directly for repayment. That single decision pulled the rug out from under the narrative my brother had been so sure of, the one where insurance always covers it, because now he was not looking at a cushioned outcome, but a legal demand letter with his name on it. And the weight of that realization showed in the frantic texts he sent me late at night, alternating between threats, insults, and desperate pleas. What I found almost amusing, in a dark way, was that at the very same time he was texting me these outbursts, he was still posting online like nothing had happened, bragging about a team retreat where he had driven colleagues in a pool car just weeks earlier, grinning in pictures that now doubled as evidence of company policy violations. I took a screenshot, added it to my folder, and quietly forwarded it to the same compliance officer who had already suspended his driving privileges, writing only, "For your records." I did not need to add anything else, because by then the pattern was obvious, and every piece of evidence I handed over was like another nail in the box he had built for himself. When I think back on that period, what strikes me most is how quickly the tide turned once I stopped carrying his weight, because for years it had felt like no matter what he did, the fallout would always find its way into my lap. And I would be the one negotiating payments, smoothing over neighbors, or absorbing my parents' guilt-ridden pleas for peace. But once I stepped back and allowed the truth to travel on its own, the consequences multiplied faster than I ever could have orchestrated myself. His employer suspended his privileges, the insurer targeted him directly, and his carefully polished image of being the golden child began to crumble under the pressure of undeniable documents. By the time I gathered my parents and my brother for what I knew would be the final meeting, the stage was already set, not by my anger or my desire for revenge, but by the undeniable, unchangeable facts of his own behavior. They still begged me to let it go, still pleaded for family unity, but I knew what they did not yet fully grasp, that tomorrow I would walk into that room with every document neatly stacked and ready to present, and for the first time in our lives, my brother would not be able to laugh his way out of it. That thought stayed with me as I closed my folder for the night, the weight of it heavy but steady, because the next move would be the one that finally changed everything. When I walked into the living room the next day with the folder under my arm and a kind of steady quiet in my chest that I had not felt since this entire mess began, I could tell by the way my parents sat together on the edge of the sofa and by the way my brother paced behind the coffee table that they had expected a scene filled with shouting and accusations and pleas for mercy. Yet what they got instead was me setting the folder down, opening it with the care of someone who has rehearsed her own boundaries until they are muscle memory, and placing 3 small stacks of paper in front of the person who had once laughed in my face while telling me that forgiveness was guaranteed because our parents would never let me hold a line. After which I took a breath and said that today was not about punishment or drama or my feelings. Today was about picking up the bill he created and handing it back to the only hands it belongs in. I began by stating the simple sequence that no one in this room could deny anymore, speaking in the same even voice I had practiced driving home the night before, explaining that he took my car without permission. that he totaled it while unlisted and unauthorized to operate it, that he misrepresented his record to me, to our parents, and to the insurer, that the insurer, after reviewing the documents we had all seen, had chosen subrogation and intended to pursue him directly, and that his employer had suspended his driving privileges pending further review due to the discrepancy between what he had implied and what the record proved, and I watched the words land not as an attack, but as a ledger, each line an entry, each entry a cost, each cost returning to its rightful owner. Then I slid the first stack across the table, a repayment plan drafted in plain language without legal fireworks yet backed by the quiet weight of enforceability, which outlined a schedule of automatic transfers from his account to mine until the full replacement value of my car, the towing and storage charges, and the weeks of rental fees were satisfied in full. And while part of me wanted to add 1,000 comments about fairness and history and all the times I had been the convenient cushion, I restrained myself because the power here was not in the speech, it was in the paper. The paragraph that said failure to make any payment on the agreed date would trigger the release of an already signed letter to the insurer consenting to immediate and aggressive recovery, together with a statement confirming his prior incidents with specificity, and I had both documents prepared and clipped beneath the repayment plan with a small binder clip that somehow felt like a lock clicking home. Before anyone could pivot to sentiment, I slid the second stack forward, a straightforward agreement requiring that he complete a certified safe driver course within a short, defined period and provide proof of completion before any conversation about forgiveness or family peace would be entertained, because I had no interest in repeat performances dressed in new apologies, and if he wanted access to a future where my car, my time, and my name were treated with respect, then he would show he could respect a process that did not bend to his charm, and while he tried to scoff, he must have seen in my face that there was no wiggle room left, because the person who once always made space for him had finally decided that space belonged to me. At that point my mother reached for my hand as if to soften the edges with a plea for mercy, and my father asked whether we might find a way to keep everything inside the family. But I told them gently that the family was the reason I had dragged this around for so many years, that love without accountability is not love at all but dependency dressed up as loyalty, and that today I was choosing adult clarity over childhood patterns. After which I took out the third stack, which was the smallest yet somehow heaviest, a concise affidavit of texts and dates regarding prior incidents, including the late-night message where he joked about borrowing the neighbor's car after drinking because mine had a tracker. And when I placed that page on top and watched the color leave his face, I knew we were done negotiating with feelings and had arrived at reality. He tried one last performance, the kind of swaggering bluff that used to work when the stakes were stories and not signatures, promising he would pay eventually, promising that this had all been blown out of proportion, promising that he was being targeted and misunderstood, but I pointed to the signature lines that were flagged with small tabs, and I explained that I was done with eventually, that the only proportion I recognized now was the proportion of cause to effect, and that if he chose not to sign today, I would leave the room, walk to my car, and deliver the insurer consent letter and the HR follow-up that very afternoon, which would move the consequences from looming to immediate, and I said it not as a threat but as an itinerary. The pen hovered, the room held its breath, and then he signed his name, once on the repayment plan, once on the consent letter that would remain sealed and inert as long as he met the schedule, and once on the safe driver commitment. And as the ink dried, I felt something inside me loosen and settle, not a rush of victory that would fade by morning, but a steadiness that comes when the ground finally matches the truth under your feet, and I handed him his copies while keeping mine tucked safely in the folder that had become, over these weeks, less a pile of papers and more a boundary in physical form. Later, after the house emptied and the echo of arguments and apologies and old patterns had drained from the air, I made tea, sat at the same table where I had opened the envelope that changed everything, and I watched the quiet like a person who had been underwater and finally broke the surface, because the repayment drafts were sitting in a neat stack, the automatic transfers were scheduled, the safe driver course links were highlighted, and the letters that could end the conversation forever. Slept behind a clip that would never need to be touched if he kept his word, and while a trace of anger still flickered somewhere in me, it felt small compared to the relief of knowing that I had rewritten my role and, in doing so, had rewritten the rules of the family story. Weeks later, a certified envelope arrived with the first payment receipt tucked inside and a short note in his handwriting that said nothing dramatic, only that he understood and that he would handle it. And I realized as I folded the note and placed it with the rest that I had not just won a fight, I had closed a loop, because I had shown myself that I could stop being the crash pad without becoming the villain, that I could outsmart the old script without turning into a mirror of the person who hurt me, and that the most satisfying revenge is not watching someone suffer, but watching yourself stand up in a way that makes the old version of you impossible to return to, which is why, when I think about the moment he totaled my car and told me I would have to forgive him, I do not feel rage anymore. I feel gratitude for the day I finally learned that you do not need permission to stop subsidizing someone else's chaos. You just need a plan, a pen, and the nerve to let consequences travel to their rightful destination.